The example of Abiathar and his connection with David, and we're going to explore in our study tonight another particular aspect of Abiathar, and that is his friendship with David and how they interacted on a spiritual level. So winding back a couple of weeks, in our previous study we finished off with David, young man in the wilderness, struggling with the whole situation in Ziklag. Remember, the Amalekites had come in, they'd taken everything, his wives, his possessions, all his belongings, and disappeared. And David was particularly sad. His own men were saying, we want to stone him. We're just tired of this running around the wilderness. Let's finish this. It's just not working out. And Abiathar steps into the gap, and you remember he encouraged David, and he said, look, if you pursue after them, you'll recover all. And David did. And that, of course, was not just the beginnings, but the consolidation of a very vital friendship for David and for Abiathar. And of course, Abiathar had been through that experience himself. He suffered great loss. Our first study, we talked about the loss of his own family. And remember there at Nob, where the priests were destroyed by Saul, he was able to take the ephod, bring it to David, and become a spiritual counsellor to the man David. Well, Abiathar said to David, you will recover all. But that didn't mean for the rest of David's life he was going to be exempt from any further difficulties. So I want you just to come back to, I'm going to pick up the record, 2 Samuel chapter 2. Because here's where David inquires again. So notice that right through the record, Abiathar is the one to whom David makes these inquiries. He was the high priest. He had the Urim and the Thummim. He was able to provide David with divine inspiration, direction and advice. So we're winding back to this particular incident, which is only just a few pages on from the one in Ziklag. Turn a couple of pages and here we are, 2 Samuel chapter 2 verse 1. And here we have this, again, reconnection with Abiathar, and David inquires. It says there in verse 1, it came to pass after this that David inquired of Yahweh, that's Abiathar now is going to provide this advice again, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And Yahweh said unto him, go up. Now you notice if you look across the page to chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, this is David's song of lament for Jonathan. And I think there's a connectedness with a loss of one friend and the leaning on another. You know, David and Jonathan were very, very close. Obviously, Jonathan was a little bit older, but David looked up to him as a spiritual mentor. And there was a very close friendship, a very emotional bond between these two men. David's just lost that. And his song of lament there is in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. So our context is immediately he leans on another friend, and that's Abiathar. Narrative's very clear that he's just lost a spiritual advisor and he turns immediately to another one. And I think there's some lessons for ourselves in that. We need to develop those types of relationships, and we do that through our ecclesial network, our interaction with one another. We're building these relationships. None of us can survive on our own. And we might like to try and think that we have that, spiritual backbone or maybe a strength of character and perseverance that we can, roller coast through all the experiences of life by ourselves. But we need the companionship and support of each other. And right here at this pivotal moment, David's lost one friend. He leans heavily on another. So David now makes inquiry. Where to now, Abiathar? Jonathan and Saul have been killed on the battlefield. The pathway is now open for kingship. Abiathar, where should I go? What should I do? Well, he asks in verse 1, and the answer comes back, go up. And David says, well, where do I go to? And the answer comes back to Hebron. So for David, of course, the pathway is open. It could have been Jerusalem. It could have been Bethlehem or Beersheba. Where should I go? You would think Jerusalem, because remember, as a boy, he took the head of Goliath to Jerusalem, so he knew that was an important central point in the geography of the land of Israel and in God's plan and purpose. But Hebron. And David may have been a little bit perplexed why Hebron, although, of course, the patriarchs obviously established themselves there. Abraham was a foundational area for Abraham. But our focus is on Abiathar. And for Abiathar, this was a wonderful direction. Hebron, not just a city of refuge, not just a city given to the Levites, but his great-great-great-grandfather was given this city. That's Abiathar. He's going back to the city of his great-great-grandfather. And of course, well, that was the descendants of Aaron. So here in Joshua 21 verse 15, it says, "Thus they gave to the children of Aaron the priest," he was the high priest, here is the descendant, Abiathar, Hebron, with its suburbs, to be a city of refuge for the slayer. So for many years, David and Abiathar have been on the run through the wilderness. Where to now, Abiathar? Where do I go? Hebron, to a city which is dedicated to the lineage of the high priests, and to a city which means fellowship. Remember, Hebron means fellowship. This is something that none of these men who have been running through the wilderness have enjoyed. They've been on the run, their life has been at risk, and now there's a pathway open, and it begins at the point of fellowship. And for 7.5 years, David settles into Hebron. And we'll notice in the narrative as well, these are little colouring exercises which I always find really helpful. This word up, worth colouring in the Bible again, is there in verse 1. "Shall I go up?" And Yahweh said to him, "Go up." "Whither shall I go up?" Verse 2, David went up hither. And verse 3 as well, "Bring up every man." So what this is not, just geographical, it's in its spiritual content as well. David now has an open pathway to the king and to kingship, but he's not going to force it. He's going to inquire of Yahweh through Abiathar. And of course, there is that evidence that spiritual relationship was being rebuilt and consolidated between David, Abiathar, and the kingdom itself. So it's interesting that David leans on Abiathar for advice, and Abiathar gives him that particular advice. And obviously, as we learnt from our previous studies, there were further occasions when Abiathar was going to be consulted by David. This was a very important relationship. And again, we've got some of those references there which we pointed to in our previous study. So there are further examples, and we'll come across to chapter 5, where we do have the next incident of the inquiry with Abiathar. So here in 2 Samuel 5, and you'll notice in verse 7, it talks about David taking the city of Jerusalem. So 7.5 years have gone by, and now David moves into the area of Jerusalem, and he takes the city. And again, he makes some consultation with Abiathar. And we'll notice again, this is an important part to this whole chapter here. David's coming to Jerusalem and he's making inquiries. David clearly realises that God has a very strong hand in the direction as to where David was going to go. So there's two important phrases here in 2 Samuel 5. Here at verse 19, David inquired of Yahweh through Abiathar the priest. Again in verse 23, David inquired of Yahweh. But obviously in the context of the narrative, David is very close to bringing God into his life. So there in verse 10, David went on and grew great. Yahweh, God of hosts, was with him. Verse 12, Yahweh had established him as king. David inquired. Verse 20, Yahweh broke forth. Verse 23, David inquired of Yahweh. Verse 24, Yahweh will go out before thee. Verse 25, Yahweh commanded him. So we can see the influence really that Abiathar is having on David. He's giving him advice, counsel and direction in life, and that's particularly important, especially because David was now king. So he wasn't just a lad running around in the wilderness. Now David has moved onto the throne and he's king. But I think there's a beautiful insight. Even though he was king, he still consulted with the high priest and sought direction from God. So the high priest himself, of course, was the one who was over the religious side, the religious aspect of the nation. The king was in charge of the civil organisation and arrangement of things, but together they would provide right direction for the nation. So David's established as king. He could have had some prominence, and obviously he did, but he still consulted consistently with Abiathar. Now you notice when David became king, at the end of chapter 5, you'll see in verse 17, there's another problem. The Philistines come up. So here in verse 17, the Philistines heard that they'd anointed David king over Israel, and they assembled. They're going to make an invasion. They're going to make life hard for David. In fact, if they could get rid of him, they could make serious inroads right into the nation. So verse 18 says, they spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. David consults with Abiathar. Verse 19, David inquired of Yahweh, shall I go up against the Philistines? Like, what a question. I mean, he's king. He's got his warriors around him. But notice he very carefully consults with Abiathar and says, do I go up against the Philistines? I mean, this is a very wonderful insight into the mind of David and his connection with Abiathar. He also asked Abiathar again in verse 22 and 23. The Philistines came yet again and spread themselves, so a second occasion. Now, David didn't presume that he knew everything and knew all the answers, and well, this is happening again, so I'll just do the same thing. Notice in verse 23, it says, David inquired of Yahweh, will I go up against the Philistines? He gets a different answer this time. It actually is, don't go up. So in the first occasion, David went up and it was a frontal attack and he was successful. The second occasion, David asked, and the answer comes back, no, you need to set up an ambushment behind, and that's the strategy and the tactic on this particular occasion. So, David is not presumptuous. He constantly refers to Abiathar for advice. And remember back, we were talking about the situation in Keilah, where David went down with his men to relieve the men of Keilah from the Philistines, and then the advice came to him, now he had to get out. And we sort of thought, well, why would he even go there in the first place? But David was following through the directions of God. And it might appear to be the same situation, the Philistines coming up and making inroads. And maybe David expected, well, a frontal assault worked last time, I'll do the same thing again. And if David said, well, this is easy, I've done all this before, maybe he would have been defeated significantly. And what's the lesson in that for us in consultation and renewal? Well, we need consistently to read from the Word of God, and that's why we have a system within our ecclesial Wednesday night study classes to break open the Bible and to make it a consistent pattern in our life. Because, some people, and I listen to them sometimes in discussion with others, they say, have you ever read the Bible? They say, yeah, I've read it once. As though like, well, I've read the Bible once and I've got all the answers, or that's all I ever need to do. So with David consulting consistently with Abiathar in very similar situations and sometimes getting a slightly different answer, the lesson to us is, of course, we need to be consistently opening the Bibles and having our minds constantly aligned with the presence and the providence of God, rather than sort of making our own decision and saying, well, I've been through this situation before, I'll just apply the same answer. It didn't work for David in this situation because he went with the advice of Abiathar, and it's the same for ourselves. And as Psalm 119 says, and this is sort of a Davidic psalm, how he loved the law of God. It was his constant meditation. Just because he was king didn't mean he could close the Bible and say, well, I'm king now, so I don't really need to consult that. He said, I love your word, and it makes me wiser than my enemies, even although they're always around me. And it's the same challenge for us, brothers and sisters, in these situations. So David was very reliant. We can see the reliance that he had on the counsellor, the high priest Abiathar, to give him appropriate advice. And Abiathar's advice was not only critical to David when he was on the run in the wilderness, it was important to him as he was king. Well, you know what's sad about the next chapter? Chapter 6 of 2 Samuel. What's really sad about the next chapter is we have nothing about David inquiring of God. We've just coloured in chapter 5 all those phrases where Yahweh was with him and he inquired of Yahweh in chapter 5, and we come to chapter 6 and that phrase is deliberately left out of the narrative to give us an insight into what was going on here. It was the bringing up of the ark, and we know that story from Sunday school very well, don't we? We know that David was very excited about getting this ark up to Jerusalem, and he went right down this pathway without any consultation, and it was disastrous. People lost their lives. And I'd like you to come across to the parallel record in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, because we're going to see the pattern here. Let's come across another little colouring exercise. 1 Chronicles chapter 13, because again, this is the parallel record of David bringing up the ark. But in this record, there's another phrase that is highlighted, and it's not that David inquired through Abiathar, it's that Abiathar was not consulted at all. And again, it's worth colouring in. And you'll see the pattern here, 1 Chronicles 13. He's going to bring up the ark. David consulted with, well, it doesn't say Abiathar, it doesn't say the high priest, doesn't even say inquired of Yahweh. It says with the captains and with every leader. Verse 2, David said to all the congregation. Verse 3, let us bring up the ark. Verse 4, all the congregation said the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. Verse 5, David gathered. Verse 6, David went up. Verse 7, they carried the ark of God in a cart. Verse 8, David and all Israel. Verse 11, David was displeased. Verse 12, David was afraid. Verse 13, so David brought not the ark home to himself. So again, here's the parallel. So we're seeing the connection that David has with Abiathar, and here in this situation, which was a great undoing, as far as David was concerned, there was no consultation with the high priest or with any information from the law of Moses as to how that ark should have been brought up. Abiathar was sidelined in David's excitement and focus on the ark. But you know, when we turn the page, we'll notice that there's Abiathar's presence comes into the narrative. Chapter 15 and verse 11, this is where the ark now comes up successfully. Chapter 15 verse 11, it says, and David called for Zadok and Abiathar, there's our reference, the priests and for the Levites, and so it goes on. So Abiathar's presence is again highlighted, and the advice was sought as to how the high priest, or how the priesthood really should bring the ark up appropriately to Jerusalem. You might wonder this interplay between Zadok and Abiathar in verse 11. All right, so the play out to this is that Abiathar was the high priest in Jerusalem and Zadok became the high priest, in a sense, down at Gibeon. All right, so you can have a look at chapter 16, verse 39. That gives you that information. We'll look at that in a minute anyway. So, Abiathar is consulted and the ark of God was brought up in right order. And again, verse 16 says, David spake to the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brethren to be singers. So this was all organised and done appropriately and properly. Now, in Sunday school, when we did these lessons, we would have a sort of pictures of David dancing with joy. And remember, he discarded his kingly robes and he had the robe of a priest because he wanted to identify very closely with what was going on in this situation as the ark came to Jerusalem. There was absolute joy, and we know for David that was a pivotal moment in his life. That was something he wanted to achieve, was getting this ark to a central point where the whole of Israel could now gather and worship. That was a big moment in David's life. But we're not talking about David, are we? We're talking about Abiathar. So can you imagine, for a moment, Abiathar's joy as the Ark of the Covenant is brought out of hiding, out of darkness. It was in a cupboard for a long, long time, and it comes up to Jerusalem. If David's joy was heightened, where would Abiathar be, who was the high priest, and the Ark of the Covenant represented him and his service to God and to Israel? Can you imagine the joy that Abiathar would have? And particularly, I'll tell you why, that ark had been hidden for 100 years. It was dusty, it was put down in Kirjath Jearim for 100 years. So it meant there was no Yom Kippur, there was no Day of Atonement. You know how important the Day of Atonement in the Jewish calendar was. That was the national forgiveness for the nation for their sins. Hadn't happened for 100 years. From the time when Samuel was just a young boy, remember this ark was taken captive? They pulled it out from Shiloh, the Philistines captured it, it went off. It wasn't the whole of the reign of Saul for 40 years. And we have the little calculations down here. If you've got really good eyes, you'll be able to see that there. But there's the calculation there, 100 years. hidden away down in Kirjath-jearim until David brought that ark up, and you could imagine Abiathar as the high priest, his excitement in that particular moment. It was central to his very life. And so for Abiathar, this was a time of great joy. This psalm here was written by David on this occasion as the ark came up. And he says, "Arise, O Yahweh," that's the ark, "into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy strength. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy." So it's nice of us, I think, to shift the focus not only from David, but more importantly in our series to Abiathar and what that meant for him. So very interestingly, the ark came up to Jerusalem. David had a tent prepared for it. What about the tabernacle? How did this all operate? Well, we know the tabernacle was left at Gibeon right through the time of David until Solomon finally built a temple and it all came together. It seems rather strange, doesn't it? And you sort of think with the Ark of the Covenant situated there in a tent in Jerusalem, what did they do with that? They still couldn't have the Day of Atonement. Well, you notice across in chapter 16 and verse 4, this is again the narrative that flows on from this occasion. Chapter 16 is all about the assembly of men and women, priests and Levites, singers and all the organisation, a psalm of praise that David wrote. But you notice in chapter 16 and verse 4, this is what the Ark of the Covenant, this is what they did to it in Jerusalem. It says he appointed certain of the Levites to minister before, here it is, the Ark of Yahweh. What did they do? Was it Day of Atonement, sacrifices? What happened? No. To record and to thank and to praise Yahweh, Elohim of Israel. And again, if you flip across to verse 37, you'll notice there, it says, so they left there before the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, Asaph and his brethren, to minister before the Ark continually as every day's work required. So there's Abiathar, he's in charge. It was an area of praise and thankfulness and song. And down in Gibeon was the rest of the tabernacle with the altar of burnt offering. So you'll see that in verse 39. It says, and Zadok the priest and his brethren before the tabernacle of Yahweh in the high place that was in Gibeon to offer burnt offerings before Yahweh. So a very interesting sort of set of circumstances, isn't it, where the tabernacle is split from the ark. But there was going to come a man later on, of course, Solomon, that was going to bring that all together, a man of peace. So even although David brought the ark up, there were still opportunities for ministering in praise and joyfulness. The singers were there, and that was under the umbrella of Abiathar, the high priest. I mean, he was directly connected to the Ark of the Covenant itself. So, sacrifice of praise, which was a very wonderful and joyful experience for the high priest Abiathar. Well, 20 years go by now before we hear of Abiathar again. Another 20 years goes by in the life of David, again very colourful experiences that he had. And the next time we hear of Abiathar is the reading we had tonight from 2 Samuel chapter 15. So we'll come across there and let's unpack, what's happening in this particular situation, because again, it gives us a very lovely insight into this connection that Abiathar had with David. So 2 Samuel chapter 15. And we're introduced to a very difficult event in David's life where his son Absalom rebelled against him and wanted to usurp the throne and take over the nation. So we're introduced to David's exit, his exile, in verse 22 and 23. Again, little colouring exercise here that illustrates what was going on. They're exiting, and this word is repeated, passed over, the Gittite passed over, all the people passed over, David himself passed over, they all passed over. And again, it talks about Abiathar here, until all the people passing out of the city. So there's a very strong emphasis on David's, in a sense, reticence to leave Jerusalem. I mean, he loved this city, he loved the people, but he'd been usurped by Absalom, and now he had to pass out of the city. And he follows the pathway, actually, of our Lord Jesus Christ many years later. He goes down into the Kidron and up through to the Mount of Olives. So there's some very interesting parallels on this particular occasion. You'll notice at the end of verse 23, again, bringing Abiathar into the whole narrative here, there, it says at the end of verse 23, all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. And again it's repeated in verse 28, see, I will tarry in the plain of the wilderness. You know, this is a repeated situation for Abiathar. He spent a lot of his young years with David in the way of the wilderness, running around. You know, and there's all that sort of confusion as to, well, I thought David was going to be king. We've spent many years running around in the wilderness. And here it's you'd think you'd get comfortable in life, and all of a sudden it's cycling back around and everyone's heading out back into the way of the wilderness. Is that a bit like our lives sometimes? You know, we go through situations, we think, okay, that's done and dusted, and then our lives cycle back through that again. And for Abiathar, it's all happening again. 35 years before this particular event, Saul slew all his family. Abiathar grabbed hold of the ephod and he ran off into the wilderness to David. 35 years later, doing almost exactly the same thing. David's exiting now, going back into the wilderness. Abiathar takes the Ark of the Covenant and prepares to move out into the wilderness. What an amazing series of events here. And Abiathar, in a beautiful and very wonderful gesture, doesn't just simply kick back in Jerusalem and say, well, David's got to deal with this. You know, I'm here in Jerusalem, I'm in charge of the ark. No, he's going to go with David. He wasn't worried about his own safety, but with Zadok he organised and the other priests to carry the ark. Because this is the man Abiathar that we're coming to respect and love and know. He was a man who was very protective of the elements of God's worship, whether it's the ephod, whether it's the ark. He was a defender of God's worship and all those spiritual aspects. He consulted, he was the counsellor to David, and now as David heads out in the wilderness, this man at 55, 60, 65 was going to do exactly the same. He was prepared to wander with David in the wilderness. And you'll note they didn't put the ark on a cart either. It was done properly on this occasion. The priests carried that out. So a couple of translations give us sort of the colour of what's happening on here. One translation says, all the land is weeping, a great voice, and all the people are passing over, and the king is passing over through the brook Kidron, and all the people are passing over on the front of the way of the wilderness. That's Young's literal. And the idea behind this, the translation, the narrative, as one suggests, however, the king remained standing in the Kidron Valley while all the people and the entire army passed on before him toward the desert. So, you know, it's a very interesting picture. Here's David's household, all his warriors, and David stands in the Kidron and they all pass before him and they're all heading off into the way of the wilderness. But what's also interesting is you notice in verse 24, they set the ark of God down. See that in verse 24, Zadok, the Levites, bearing the ark of the covenant of God, and here it is, and they set down the ark of God. There's almost a duplication here of the time when Joshua came into the land. Do you remember, Joshua was leading them into the promised land. It was a time of great excitement, and they put the ark of the covenant in the centre of the Jordan River. The priest stood by it, and all the people passed by, and then the ark followed. It's almost like a duplication of this is occurring here. One going into the land, and one, of course, exiting the land. So there was that sense that they were repeating a little bit of history, but the ark was there and placed in the centre of the Kidron as the people went by to indicate what? The evidence of God's guidance. Just back in the days of Joshua, that's why the priests did that, and now here again, the priests are illustrating to the people that God's guidance is going to go with them. Well, the record also says there in verse 24, and Abiathar went up. So there's the indication there that Abiathar not only continued on with David up the Mount of Olives, but this translation here, which is the NET, the NIV, NLT, there's several translations that translate the Hebrew slightly different. It's sort of interesting. It says Zadok and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. When they had positioned the ark of God, here it comes. Instead of saying Abiathar went up, it's the Hebrew word for like ascend, and they interpret that as offering sacrifices. So these translations say, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Again, interesting because it gives us an insight into the calibre of Abiathar. Not a panicky man. He's a man now that's going to give spiritual encouragement to the people as they pass by. I mean, all these people are distressed. They're weeping. They're sorrowful. I don't know what's going to... They're all heading out into the wilderness with wives and children and warriors. What's going to happen? And here is Abiathar. The ark is set down and he's calming the people. He's offering sacrifices. He's bringing God into this whole circumstance and situation. And it was his duty, wasn't it, really, as the high priest to do that, to lift the nation's spirits as they were shattered by this particular event. And I wonder, thinking about Abiathar, thinking about how everything was done properly. I mean, it took time to get the ark organised and the priests. And they brought that out, they put in the Kidron. Abiathar tries to lift the minds of the people as they're headed into, well, who knows where, into the desert, into the wilderness. Abiathar was a man who was constantly bringing God into the equation of life. Wonder if we do that often, regularly, and even more importantly, when things go wrong in life. You know, we pick up the phone or someone gives us some news and we just, well, not necessarily that we panic, but we often don't stop and pause and bring God into the situation. Now, I know Colin and Kerry aren't here, so I'm going to talk about a situation that we went through some years back when we were in Hong Kong with Colin and Kerry and Spencer was born. And I remember the event very, very clearly because, you know, information was coming through about Spencer. He wasn't particularly well. Colin and Kerry were really worried. Should they head back to Australia? And I remember the moment we stood outside of Noah's Ark. There's a place, you can actually visit Noah's Ark in Hong Kong. It's a full-size replica. And I can remember we made the decision there, Colin and Kerry did, they said, look, we've got to head back because this is a very serious situation. We don't know what the outcome is. And I can remember standing there and we prayed together. And to me, a really special moment and a moment that was very helpful for all of us. And I see this in Abiathar here as all the people are going out, they don't know what's happening, women with children, you know, where's it all going to end? And Abiathar comes and he's got the ark, he's offering sacrifices and praises and prayers. What a beautiful and a very wonderful man that David could lean on in times of distress. Well, it appears that Abiathar ascended the Mount of Olives because David in verse 25 addresses only Zadok, doesn't he? It says, the king said unto Zadok, carry back the ark of God into the city. If I find favour in the eyes of Yahweh, he'll bring me again. But we notice, of course, from verse 29 that they both Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back into the city of Jerusalem. So David was laying a very important lesson here, 4 points. Why send the ark back? Number one, he recognised that the ark was there for the public worship and the honour of God, not his own personal safety. Right, so he tells Zadok and Abiathar, he says, I want you guys to take the ark back to you. I don't own it, I don't possess it. It's there for the nation, for the public worship and honour of God. And that ark is there for the benefit of the nation, for all of Israel, not some personal thing that belongs to me. Secondly, he left it there because he was going to remind whoever came into Jerusalem of God's providence and God's hand and God's involvement in life. And thirdly, as David says here, if God's will that he was to be disposed and Absalom was to be king, if that was God's will, then David had no right to the ark. And finally, as we know from the storyline itself, fourthly, David wanted to have the loyal relationship, friendship of Zadok and Abiathar and their sons to provide support and information to David as he ran off into the wilderness. He didn't know what was going on himself. So I think this is a beautiful thing about friendship. You see, what David is doing here is he's giving a spiritual lesson to Abiathar in one sense. Now there's Abiathar who's the high priest and he's bringing the ark out and David says, listen, it's not the letter of the law, Abiathar, it's the spirit of the law that's important to me. I don't need a piece of furniture to come with me into the wilderness because I believe God is a part of my life and if he brings me back to Jerusalem, so be it. And I just think there's a wonderful interaction of spiritual friendship where both of these men are educated. Now, Abiathar in one sense is educated to go beyond the letter of the law and to envelop himself in the spirit of the law. There's an education process there. And of course, for all of us, we need those good spiritual friends. I just like this little comment here. It says, a good friend is one who points you to Christ and pushes you closer to God. And sometimes that's tough, isn't it? Because what our brothers and sisters say to us, we sometimes think, well, that's not very helpful, or it's not very encouraging, or doesn't lift my spirit. But sometimes in the advice that they provide for us, it helps bring us closer to where we need to be, closer to Christ, closer to God. As we have there, Proverbs 27, iron sharpens iron. It's what we're doing tonight, and it's what we should do, on occasions where we have those opportunities to interact with each other, talk about the Bible, and to be educated in spiritual matters. And I'm very thankful that I have brothers and sisters that I can talk to on Bible passages and questions that I have, and they can provide me with answers. That's very helpful. And I've also got brothers and sisters who may not be highly educated in the word of truth, but they live it in spirit, and that's inspiring as well. So all these examples are helpful to us in life. Well, at the end of verse 29, it says there, Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God again to Jerusalem, and they tarried there. And I find that a sort of a very sad little comment. Here's a man who's been with David for 35 years, and he's having to turn away from David and go back. And that would be very difficult, especially when, as we know, Absalom's turned all the hearts of the nation to Absalom. So the entire nation is starting to drift away from David, too old, he hasn't got his hands on what's going on. Absalom, he's young, he's vibrant, he's good looking. This is the man we want. And the nation's starting to drift into that zone. And Abiathar's been with David for 35 years, and he's prepared to go back into Jerusalem. It's a little bit like that situation with David and Jonathan. Remember their last meeting together? And I'm sure Jonathan would have loved to run off with David, because these two men had an affinity, had the same wavelength. But Jonathan went back to the palace because he had a responsibility to look after the nation, while Saul spent all his time chasing after David. And it's not much different here. Abiathar recognises that as the high priest of Israel, he has a responsibility to protect the nation and protect the ark. And again, you could imagine with Absalom, who completely disregarded anything that was godly, and Ahithophel, who was a bitter, broken man, who had sided now with Absalom. You could imagine that these men could have quite easily come in and smashed the ark and everything it represented. I mean, Saul tried to destroy the priesthood. These men probably weren't that much different. They had no time for God. It was all about themselves. So Abiathar had the responsibility of protecting the ark and the spiritual values of the nation. So for Abiathar, it was a very difficult circumstance. And of course, he would have connected to the sorrow that David experienced as he ascended up that Mount of Olives with all his warriors. There were 600 of them, and those 600 warriors had been with him for a lifetime. They were very faithful warriors. They're all going with him. These men are, late 50s, in their 60s. They're not young men, but they're battle-hardened warriors. They're going with David. And I can see David weeping. He's sorrowful. Everything's turned into a mess. And as he looks down the Kidron Valley, he sees Jerusalem, and he sees his faithful friend Abiathar and Zadok carrying the ark back, and they disappear into the darkness of Jerusalem. That was not easy for those men. They were going back into the battle zone. It might have been easier for them to drift off into the wilderness with David. David says to Abiathar, I want you back in Jerusalem. Abiathar says, yeah, I'll do that. And he heads right back into ground zero. So he was, this wasn't an easy thing for Abiathar. And the news comes in verse 31 to David that Ahithophel is among the conspirators. And this was a man with whom David had a long-standing relationship. He was the counsellor. He was the wise man of Israel. He'd done a flip, and he was now going with Absalom. So you can see the pressure that David's under. And as he hears that news, there's another wonderful friend in verse 32, a man called Hushai, who was also a counsellor. He comes and he wants to go with David into the wilderness, but you'll notice in verse 33, David says, look, you'll be a burden unto me. And one would imagine that this wise counsellor was probably fairly aged, and David was worried he wouldn't survive the wilderness. So he said, look, probably better for you to go back into Jerusalem. I don't know what's going to happen in the wilderness. So again, Hushai goes back into Jerusalem as well, because that's where these men, Abishai, Hushai, could best help David in this circumstance. And for ourselves as friends, we can't be everything. Sometimes we might imagine ourselves to be superior in some sort of element in helping other people. Oh, maybe not. Sometimes there are the little simple things in life that others find very encouraging. So for Abiathar, we notice he's mentioned in verse 35 and verse 36. In fact, Abiathar is mentioned 3 times here, so obviously very significant in this critical time of David's life. Verse 35, Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Tell it to Zadok and Abiathar, and we have their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan's, Abiathar's sons. There's 5 men here, 5 men who are going to do their best to undermine Absalom's plans. And all of these men were taking big risks for the sake of David and the kingdom. They considered it an honour to serve David in whatever capacity David directed them. And of course, their movement back into the city of Jerusalem was going to be one of those elements. Abiathar accepted it. There was no argument with David at all. He didn't try to convince David, no, I should go. No, he said, if that's what you feel, David, I'll do that for you. And Abiathar fully accepted that pressure. And I sort of think, as a high priest, well, maybe as a teenager growing up into a high priest, Abiathar may have wondered about how his life was going to unravel. Was it going to be, around the tabernacle, singing praises, offering sacrifices? There would be joyful worship, and he'd walk around in his beautiful, pristine garments. Well, that didn't happen to Abiathar. He spent a lifetime on the run. He went with David, he was his counsellor and advisor, and life turned sour at the end, and Abiathar still remained a strong personal help to David. In the end, Abiathar would have realised it's not about just singing praises around the ark. It's about practical help and support in real ways to other brothers and sisters. That's the life of a priest. That's the life of a high priest. That's our lives, really. I know we enjoy coming to the meeting and singing praises, but that's not all that it is. In reality, we follow the same pathway as Abiathar here, and we need to give help and support to each other in times of need. And I'm sure when we think back to our teenage years, and it's starting to get sort of very dim now, our memories of that as we age, I'm sure as teenagers we had a pretty straight understanding of how to get to the kingdom. And it was like A to B. That was pretty well it. We'd be baptised, Jesus would be here, and the kingdom would come. And as we get older, we realise in the swirl of the circumstances of life, there's many events that have happened that we were perhaps unexpected or maybe even unprepared for. But that's life in the truth. And that's Abiathar, and that's what he did for David. So I see for Abiathar, the king's counsellor, a wonderful man. He remained David's friend even when David was not popular. He could have flipped pretty easily like Ahithophel and said, well, I don't know, I'm here by the ark. Whoever becomes king, I'll serve them. No, he didn't do that. When David was not popular, he was David's friend. He did it decisively. He did it voluntarily. There was no argumentation. He did it publicly. Everyone knew who he belonged to, where his relationship was. And he did it knowing that the fate of David could become his fate as well. Our Lord Jesus Christ says, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And that's what Abiathar was doing when he headed back into Jerusalem. He didn't know what the outworking was going to be. So a very wonderful example for us. What are some of the lessons then we've learnt tonight? Do we have conversations with others about God and about the Bible? David inquired of Abiathar. Sometimes people, and teenagers, if we've got a family, our kids ask us questions about the Bible. Do we have the answers? Are we happy to converse with them on those subjects? Different circumstances that arise require different answers. When the Philistines came up, David confronted them face on, beat them. Next time when they came up, that wasn't the answer. Do we try a one-box-fits-all to everything and everyone in life? People need different answers to circumstance in life. We've got to be big enough and wise enough to handle those answers. Do we find the worship of God a joy and something helpful in life? As that ark was brought up into Jerusalem, that was Abiathar's responsibility, to minister in joyful praise before the ark. Do we keep our head and our spiritual balance when we are thrust into uncertain and turbulent situations? There's Abiathar, calm, bringing the ark, offering sacrifices, raising the spirit of the people in a particularly difficult circumstance. And what risks are we prepared to take for others? There's Abiathar heading back into Jerusalem, heading back into ground zero, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. What risks do we take for our brothers and sisters? They're the great lessons that we learn from Abiathar, the king's counsellor.